By the forward entrance to the grand staircase between the first and second funnel, the band, now wearing life jackets on top of their overcoats, scraped lustily away at ragtime. The passengers were just as calm, although they too had their jumpers. Frederick Hoyt saw his wife into collapsible D, leapt and swam to where he thought the boat might pass. He guessed well. In a few minutes boat D splashed by and hauled him in. For the rest of the night he sat soaked to the skin, rowing hard to keep from freezing. But for the most part, the passengers merely stood, waiting or quietly pacing the boat deck. New York and Philadelphia society continued to stick together. John B. Thayer, George and Harry Widener, Dwayne Williams formed a little knot. Lesser luminaries like Clinch Smith and Colonel Gracie hovering nearby. John Jacob Astor remained pretty much alone, and the Strausses sat down on deck chairs. Jack Thayer and Milton Long debated whether to jump. The davit they were using as a gauge showed the Titanic was going much faster now. Thayer wanted to jump out, capture an empty lifeboat fall, slide down and swim out to the boats he could dimly see 500 or 600 yards away. He was a good swimmer. Long, not nearly as good, argued against it and persuaded Thayer not to try. Further forward, Colonel Gracie lent his penknife to the men struggling with the collapsibles lashed to the officers' quarters. They were having a hard time, and Gracie wondered why. Some of the third-class passengers had now worked their way up to the boat deck, and others were drifting towards the gradually rising stern. The after poop deck, normally third-class space anyhow, was suddenly becoming attractive to all kinds of people. Aulus Abelseth was one of those who reached the boat deck. Most of the evening he had been all the way aft with his cousin, his brother-in-law, and the two Norwegian girls. With the other steerage men and women, they aimlessly waited for someone to tell them what to do. Around 1:30, an officer opened the gate to first class and ordered the women to the boat deck. At 2 o'clock, the men were allowed up too. Many now preferred to stay where they were. This would clearly be the last point above water. But Abelseth, his cousin and brother-in-law, went up on the chance that there was still a boat left. The last one was pulling away. So they just stood there, as worried about being in first class as by the circumstances that brought them there. Abelseth watched the crew trying to free the collapsibles. Once an officer searching for extra hands called, "Are there any sailors here?" Abelseth had spent 16 of his 27 years on the sea and felt he should speak up, but his cousin and brother-in-law pleaded, "No, let us just stay here together." So they did. They felt rather awkward and said very little. It was even more awkward when Mr. and Mrs. Strauss drew near. "Please," the old gentleman was saying, "get in the lifeboat and be saved." "No, let me stay with you," she replied. Abelseth turned and looked the other way. Within the ship, the heavy silence of the deserted rooms had a drama of its own. The crystal chandeliers of the à la carte restaurant hung at a crazy angle, but they still burned brightly, lighting the fawn panels of French walnut and the rose-coloured carpet. A few of the little table lights with their pink silk shades had fallen over, and someone was rummaging in the pantry, perhaps for something to fortify himself. The Louis Quinze lounge, with its big fireplace, was silent and empty. The Palm Court was equally deserted. One passerby found it hard to believe that just 4 hours ago it was filled with exquisitely dressed ladies and gentlemen sipping after-dinner coffee, listening to chamber music by the same men who now played gay songs on the boat deck above. The smoking room was not completely empty. When a steward looked in at 2:10, he was surprised to see Thomas Andrews standing all alone in the room. Andrews' lifebelt lay carelessly across the green cloth top of a card table. His arms were folded over his chest. His look was stunned. All his drive and energy were gone. A moment of awed silence, and the steward timidly broke in. "Aren't you going to have a try for it, Mr. Andrews?" There was no answer, not even a trace that he had heard. The builder of the Titanic merely stared aft.